While the entire world is once again talking about possible peace negotiations in the war in Ukraine, the reality on the front lines looks very different. Fighting continues unabated, even around Christmas, with intense battles raging across large parts of eastern Ukraine. And over the past few weeks, the Russian army has increasingly relied on a tactic that appears both unusual and deeply unsettling. A tactic that many believed had disappeared from modern warfare more than 100 years ago. Russia is bringing back cavalry. More and more videos have surfaced showing Russian soldiers riding horses along the front line, sometimes heavily armed, attempting to approach or even attack Ukrainian positions. Images that feel less like the 21st century and more like something out of a history book. So what is really behind these attacks? Why is Russia suddenly using horses again? And what does this say about the current state of the war and the situation at the front? That is exactly what we are going to take a closer look at today. The former image of the Russian army as a modern, powerful military force has largely collapsed. What was once considered the second strongest army in the world has become a shadow of its former self. Where modern battle tanks and infantry fighting vehicles once advanced and elite airborne units conducted complex operations, we now see poorly trained infantry, often physically impaired, struggling at the front. And now, increasingly, soldiers riding into battle on horseback. This development did not come out of nowhere. Over the past 4 years, Vladimir Putin has effectively pushed his entire military through a meat grinder. The result has been catastrophic. Russia has lost an estimated 1.2 million soldiers in Ukraine. That is more than the entire size of its pre-war standing army. At the beginning of 2022, just before the full-scale invasion, Russia's active armed forces were estimated at around 900,000 to just over 1 million soldiers, not including reserves. By the end of 2025, total Russian military losses are expected to reach roughly 1.2 million. In less than 4 years, the Kremlin has essentially destroyed its own army and then rebuilt it under wartime conditions. But this new Russian army has very little in common with the professional force that existed before the war. Where trained contract soldiers once fought, today large parts of the front are held by men who are barely fit for service. Alcoholism, drug abuse, untreated injuries, and severe psychological trauma are widespread. To keep manpower flowing to the front, Russia has drastically lowered its medical and psychological requirements for soldiers. Even individuals suffering from psychosis, schizophrenia, severe personality disorders, or chronic alcoholism are now officially classified as fit for service. Reports indicate that soldiers who developed serious mental illnesses at the front were sent back into combat units after only brief stays in psychiatric facilities, despite earlier medical assessments that deemed them unfit for frontline duty. All of this highlights one central issue. Russia is facing severe recruitment problems and can no longer replace the combat effectiveness it has lost. And it's not just manpower. The Kremlin has also lost enormous amounts of military equipment. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Russia has lost roughly 11,000 tanks, along with tens of thousands of other armored vehicles and troop carriers. When you look at these losses in both men and material, it becomes clear why today's Russian army is no longer comparable to the force that invaded Ukraine in 2022. Still, some of the tactics Russia is now using appear almost surreal. One of them is the return of cavalry. The use of animals by the Russian army in Ukraine is not entirely new. Already last year, there were numerous recordings of donkeys and horses being used near the front. These animals were primarily employed as pack animals to transport supplies, because Russia lacked sufficient trucks and vehicles to properly supply its forces. Some pro-Kremlin voices tried to downplay this, but the reality was clear. It was a sign of logistical failure. Yes, even modern armies sometimes use pack animals. Mountain units, including those in NATO countries, still rely on mules or horses in high alpine terrain where vehicles simply cannot operate. But eastern Ukraine is not high alpine terrain. There are no mountain ranges that would require such methods. Russia used these animals not out of tactical necessity, but because it lacked alternatives. And in recent weeks, the situation has escalated further. The Kremlin has begun deploying mounted combat units, with soldiers riding horses directly toward the front line. Ukrainian drone footage has confirmed these cavalry-style attacks. In one documented case, Ukrainian soldiers from the 92nd Assault Brigade spotted a group of Russian troops approaching on horseback. Shortly after being detected, the unit was engaged and destroyed by Ukrainian drones. The attack ended in disaster. This naturally raises the question, why would Russia do this in late 2025? Why send soldiers into battle on horses in a war dominated by drones, precision artillery, and real-time surveillance? The short answer is simple. Russia is doing this because it has no good alternatives. In a modern drone war, a living, breathing animal with a strong heat signature is one of the worst things you can bring onto the battlefield. Horses offer no real advantage under constant aerial surveillance. When horses appear on a modern battlefield, it is not because someone discovered a forgotten tactical edge. They appear because something else has failed. They appear because fuel deliveries are unreliable, vehicles do not survive long at the front, and roads effectively cease to exist once artillery has done its work. Before mechanized warfare, cavalry represented speed, flexibility, and control. At a time when the fastest thing on the battlefield was a galloping horse, cavalry could exploit gaps faster than infantry could react. But industrialized warfare made this logic obsolete. In a battlefield dominated by cheap drones carrying explosives, cavalry is not innovation. It is desperation. The return of mounted units is therefore another symbol of the Russian army's decline. An army that once planned deep armored breakthroughs now struggles to advance a few hundred meters using infantry assaults supported by horses and motorcycles. Large-scale armored offensives covering dozens of kilometers in a single day are no longer realistic. However, this situation needs to be understood correctly. It is not that Russia has run out of tanks. Russian tank losses have indeed been enormous, with roughly 11,000 destroyed. But thanks to vast Soviet-era storage depots and an intensified refurbishment program, Russia has managed to replace many of these losses. In fact, some analysts argue that Russia now possesses more armored vehicles than it did in early 2022, although many of them are older and less capable models. Despite losing up to 16,000 vehicles, Russia reactivated nearly 13,000 from long-term storage and added around 4,000 newly produced vehicles. On paper, Russia still has a large armored force. So why not use it? The answer lies in the nature of the battlefield. Ukraine has become a transparent battlefield. Drones provide constant, real-time surveillance. Any concentration of armor is detected far behind the front line and can be targeted by loitering munitions, artillery, or FPV drones. As a result, massed armored assaults have repeatedly ended in disaster for Russia, often costing hundreds of soldiers and dozens of vehicles in a single failed attack. So the Kremlin faces a brutal calculation. Either continue using armored units, make little progress, and suffer heavy losses of expensive equipment, or rely on small infantry units, motorcycles, and even horses, advance slowly but lose less high-value material. This is why Russia is using cavalry. Not because tanks no longer exist, but because they are increasingly unusable under current conditions. Whether this will remain the case in the future, or whether armored warfare will adapt and return in a different form, is an open question. But for now, the image of Russian soldiers riding horses into battle tells us one thing very clearly. This war has pushed one of the world's largest militaries into a state of improvisation and exhaustion that few could have imagined just a few years ago. Let me know what you think about the use of cavalry in the Ukraine war. And what do you think we might see next? Thanks for watching. Take care and see you next time.